All right, all right, we're gonna get started. So, let's see. So I think everybody knows me in here, but for those that don't, I'm the engineering manager across Order Stream. So that's all of the different squads and operations side of things. Let's see what else. That's my Twitter handle. It's not true. You won't see me code. Made that a while ago when I was coding a lot more. Mostly it's just complaining about things related to code. So yeah, we're going to talk about time thieves today. So we're going to talk about different ways that your time can be stolen from you and some thoughts as how to approach avoiding that. So this is all based off a book from Domenica DeGrandis. She's got some talks out there too. So she wrote a book called Making Work Visible, where she's trying to kind of flip the Kanban idea on its head in the sense that let's not talk about Kanban, let's talk about why we need Kanban. And that's what we're going to do today. So I think we can at times get stuck a little bit too much when we think Kanban. We go like our brains go immediately to the dev board, but this is going to be kind of trying to expand how you think about making work visible and realize that there's a lot more than just what's on your development board. So today, I'm going to explain why you should care and talk a little bit about time, explain who the thieves are, explain how to expose them, and I'm going to hopefully bring back Comic Sans. So I was looking for something that was a little more sketch-like, more whiteboardy, so obviously Comic Sans is a good choice for that. So when we see these phrases like time spent or time wasted or time saved, I think of another word that we spend, waste, and save. Does anybody know what that word might be?
Work.
Money. So when we're talking about time, we frame our conversations about time like money because it's one of the most precious resources we have. So thinking about how to harness time is not a new thing. Prehistoric humans started to track phases of the moon to understand longer cycles of time. The Sumerians brought in the sexagesimal system to add minutes to hours to days. And then the Persians realized that with these sun clocks we had problems on cloudy days, so they started using water clocks. Fast forwarding to today, it's a very uphill battle. We have round-the-clock expectations, and it's only getting worse. We live in a chaos of modern work, and it's overloading us, and it's distracting us, and it's impeding our effectiveness. This is notifications on your phone, your email, the push models that are being created throughout the world. So we can do better. If we don't, and we're not looking at making this work visible, then we're going to start to make us blind to what our capacity truly is. We're going to create stress. We're going to compound on itself to create more blind spots. And it's also going to reduce our quality. So when you're so busy that you can't take the time to realize how busy you are, you're going to make yourself get even more busy because you're then not managing what your current workload is effectively. So I'm a hypocrite. I had my sister type this up while I was driving yesterday because I had not figured out how to effectively make time in my life to build this presentation. So,
did she insert this slide?
No.
Okay.
No, I wrote it. I edited it afterwards. I told her I was gonna though. She needed a drive. It was an hour away, meeting up with our family. So I said, yes, I can do that. But you're gonna write this presentation for me. So let's start talking about time thieves. I found this amazing picture online when I Googled image for time thieves. I'm very proud of it.
Okay, I have that.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right, so these are the 5 thieves we're going to talk about. Too much WIP, and WIP, for those that don't know, is work in progress. Unknown dependencies, unplanned work, conflicting priorities, and neglected work. You can also think of WIP not just as work in progress, but any partially completed work. That may expand your mentality of what you're thinking when I say WIP. So that could be something that's not showing up as in progress, but you started work on it, and then it's going in and out of progress, you're waiting on somebody. And too much whip is the ringleader. That's why it's got its fancy ringleader hat there. So too much whip is a leading indicator of all of these other things. So unknown dependencies, unplanned work, conflicting priorities, and neglected work usually are an undercurrent that you can expose when you start to realize you have too much whip. So let's talk a little bit more about too much whip. So why do we allow it? We allow too much whip because we're team players. We don't want to be criticized because yes is easier than saying no. It's very hard to tell somebody no up front when they ask you to do something. We also have shiny new object syndrome. So when you have something that you want to complete it usually gets a bit less glamorous right near the end. And then somebody says, hey, what about this idea to move this project into containers and Docker? And you're like, yeah, let's start that and forget this thing over here. We'll get to it later. 4 is a big one. We don't realize how big requests are. No matter how many times I say that to myself, I still find myself accepting requests and assuming they're smaller than they truly are. And in general, we just like to please people. So when a push model comes in and provides you a piece of work and you don't have that visibility on your whip, it's really hard to justify what would become a negative interaction by saying, no, I can't do that. So like I was saying earlier, whip is more than your dev board. whip is the meetings you need to attend, the interviews that you're conducting, the incoming requests from other teams, it's emails, and it's more than just your whip. It has layers. So you have a personal whip of things that you're working on that may include some of those items above. Then your team has whip, and that might be in your dev board, but it's also beyond that. There's things that you need to do that don't show up there. And then there's organizational whip, and think of that as this newer idea of milestones or initiatives, where how many things are we actively trying to pursue as a company at the same time? An important item to hit home is that partially completed work has no value. So it's hard to get into this mentality, and it's something that Gavin has really been trying to hit home, is that we need to do a better job at getting obsessed with completing, not starting. The human brain is just going to be more interested in starting new work. Give me that Docker container, or that new approach to building, or this new JS framework that just got made last week and everybody loves. So how many times have you been asked, do you have 5 minutes? I am probably one of the worst people at this too, so I probably asked half the people in this room if they have 5 minutes. I was lying. Anytime anybody asks if you have 5 minutes, it's got to be a minimum of a half an hour. There's more than just what it takes to do whatever they're requesting. You're going to under account for the time it takes, and you've just made a decision to not do something else. So that is once again an example of you're enabling somebody to push something into your queue, thereby delaying all other things. But it's really easy when the question is asked to only think about not what I'm not doing, but just that I want to get that done to help that person out. So let's talk about context switching. So if you imagine somebody saying, do you have 5 minutes, or just the fact that you have 4 things on your board, it can take up to 20 minutes to get back into context switching into deep work. I told my girlfriend that number, and she said, that's absolutely wrong. I've seen you when you're trying to get into deep work. It's got to be way more than that. Because I sit there and I'll spin on a hard topic for at least 40 minutes if I get interrupted, and it can cause some serious problems for me. So this illustration on the bottom is the idea that every time you switch, it's going to have a cost. I think it's a little bit of a lie, because there should be a little bit of cost right there and a little bit of cost right there. But generally, the point remains the same. If you continually context switch between multiple tasks, even if they're the same amount of tasks on this middle one and this bottom one, you're going to lose this amount of time to context switching. So there's a waste there. DevOps is a great example of trying to reduce the switching and context costs. If we can enable somebody to shepherd one work item throughout the entire process, that means that you don't have to have a context switch on who handles that piece of work, because every time it changes hands, that's another type of switch. It's a person switch and not a context switch. But A person A to a person B is going to have that black line in between that handoff phase. Another word to watch out for is just. So anytime you hear somebody say, "Can we just do this?" or "Couldn't we just complete it doing it this way?" or "I just need to finish this up," that's usually a sign of them trying to instigate an item either into your WIP or protect an item from leaving their WIP that is of lower value. So WIP takeaways. Saying yes means more WIP. You need to hit that home in your brain. Context switching is a major consequence of too much WIP, and WIP is not just your development board. It's bigger than that. So let's move on to the next thief. So thief unknown dependencies is focused on different types of dependencies and how they can interrupt your work. So from an architecture perspective, an unknown dependency could be something like an outage in AWS. We've decided that the value of using AWS is higher than the risk of the unknown dependency failures that it could introduce. Expertise, that's focused on things like tribal knowledge. So when you have an item that you can't complete because you need to talk to Bob, and Bob's the only one that knows how it works, that's an example of thief unknown dependency rearing its head with regards to expertise. From an activity perspective, imagine that if you have a step that is required by some other person to complete as part of an activity, such as me having to approve all releases that go out on a given day, and then I'm in a meeting all day, that's going to create wait time, that's going to likely introduce context switching, and that's all wasted cost. So I want to do an exercise to try to kind of exemplify how big of a problem this can become. So if you have two dependencies and each one has a 50-50% chance of success, what is your likelihood of success? Anybody?
25.
Yeah, 25%. So that would be 2 to the second power. So if we keep moving forward and we say, okay, now we have 3, what's our likelihood of success?
12 and a half.
Yeah, it's 1 in 8. So now you have it rounds, but 12-ish% chance of success. All right, so now let's take it to the extreme. Well, not too extreme. It's a potential realistic situation. And let's say we have 20 dependencies. I don't expect you guys to figure this number out off your top of your head. What's that?
One in about 1 million.
Yeah, okay. Or I expect James to do it. So that's 1 in 1,048,576. So if you had 20 dependencies that each had a 50-50% chance of success, the likelihood that all of them will succeed is 1 in 1 million. Or essentially 0% chance of success. Unknown dependencies is going to rear its head in the form of high coordination costs. This is the idea behind Jeff Bezos' 2 pizza teams, and thinking that if we can arrange our teams such that if we were to have pizza as a meal, 2 pizzas would suffice, then all of our dependencies are so tightly knit that we can execute quicker. But it has another side to it too, because if you just do that by thinking about none of the unknown dependency thieves, you're going to likely increase coordination costs. An easy example of that would be a monolithic release cycle. If you reduce your team sizes, but you're not changing your architecture, your context switch costs will go up in the form of merging other people's changes and figuring out how to release a larger batch of work that is outside of your scope. So in general, when coordination needs are high, people are not going to be available. That's just the fact of the matter. The more people you need, the more likelihood that one won't be there. Just like if you weren't able to be seated at a table for dinner and you had 5 guests coming and they wouldn't seat you unless all 5 were there, you're not going to be seated on time. So to introduce this next thief, Joshua Corman, who's big in the DevOps scene, has this quote that I like, that I recognize that my code will be used in ways that I cannot anticipate in ways it was not designed for and longer than it was ever intended. That's a good way to introduce Thief unplanned work. So to explain what this is, I have this example between Team A and Team B. So imagine Team A decides to integrate with Team B's service, and Team B has higher priority work, but Team A promises that they won't have to do anything. We're going to simply integrate with the existing service that you provide. Then Team A's new integration triples the capacity needs of Team B's service. At this point, you now have Team B spending the next several days figuring out how to scale up their service, and we've now pulled them away from higher priority work. It is delusional, though, to think that everything could be known up front. What I'm not saying is that we need to plan for everything, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take the time to try to consider what we don't know. In general, when you're thinking about unplanned work, you're expecting what you would experience is an increase in risk to delay, which is thereby a reduce in predictability. And anytime, one of the tricky problems with unplanned work is it's a very common source of lower morale. So when things don't happen the way you expect them to, that's very frustrating. So like I said before, just because you don't know what you don't know doesn't mean that you don't plan for the unplanned work at all. Very confusing, but in short, just because it's unplanned doesn't mean that you shouldn't be ignoring it. You should try to account for it as best as possible. All right, so let's move on to Thief conflicting priorities. So here's some warning signs that you have conflicting priorities. You have engineers constantly trying to get clarity on project priorities. You have managers constantly trying to get status on projects. You have a team that looks really busy but doesn't seem to be making any progress. You have more than half of your projects listed as top priority. You are experiencing disagreements on what's most important. And you're spending countless hours in meetings trying to figure out what those priorities are. So there's always one thing that's the most important, and it's our job to try to figure out what that is. That is really hard to do. Conflicting priorities lead to too much WIP, which then is going to lead to longer cycle times, which then is going to lead to lower throughput. So if we can't figure out what's most important, those context switching costs are likely to rear their head that we were talking about earlier. And we know that in a CPU, context switching is expensive, and that we think it's a problem. We are way less inefficient than that, or way less efficient than that. All right, Thief neglected work. So in general, old software is not a problem. Poorly maintained old software is a problem. So think of that like we have this thing that requires tribal knowledge that hasn't been touched in several years, and when something happens to it, nobody knows how to work on it. That's a problem. We have this old piece of software that's fully automated, has clean documentation, and the process itself handles any problems that come up. That's a lot less of a problem. You should always expect your old systems to eventually block or delay. It's just the nature of them existing. Even if you do nothing with it, it will eventually, the things around it will grow or change or evolve such that it will eventually become a blocker. If it's an old server that's on, if it's an old server that nobody touches, maybe it was on hardware and now you're virtualizing. If it was a virtual server, maybe you're retiring your cloud center or your center and you're going up to the cloud. There's a lot of ways that this can happen. If it's an old Java 6 app and you need to get upgrades done, but there's a dependency to other things that are on that box so that you can upgrade the things that you work on because this thing is in the same ecosystem. Short-term thinking is always going to sway prioritization to new features over maintenance. That is the nature of what we work on, and it's our job to try to prioritize those as best as possible. But obviously you need to be conscientious of what's balancing value to customer versus risk. So busy cultures in general are going to create neglected work. But we need to remember that busy does not mean productivity, and we would never want our CPU running at 100%. So There's an important takeaway here where if you feel like you've been running at 100%, that means that all of these thieves are at risk of stepping into your workload. Anytime you're at 100%, you're not taking the time to think and reflect on what's the most efficient way to do things. Another form of neglected work is zombie projects. So we've all experienced these at different times. These are low-value work that's barely alive. When we discover it, we should be killing it. If it's important, it will return back from the dead. So the biggest cause of zombie projects, from my experience, is the paralysis of sunk cost thinking. We, as humans, constantly see this, in like Texas Hold'em form. You have this gambling pot that you've paid into, and then the river turns, and you have a 0% chance of winning, and the other person outbets you, and you still want to put money in because you feel like you have invested so much into this that you're just going to throw away more money to see it complete. You have to think of projects as not how much you've invested in them, but how much more you will have to invest versus the value that they will provide. So back on the revenue generating versus protecting. It's always going to be hard to quantify revenue protection. So this is going to be the work that piles up. And this is where making work visible is an effective tool to help justify them. So if things like, I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. Yeah, upgrading your Java system. It's going to be really hard to show the value of that. So you have to think of unique ways to slice the data to help show what productivity losses or risks you're introducing. So you have to think of, there's also a need to always be shining a light on how long work is neglected versus the new work is taking over. So this is things like we have a backlog and the work just hops over it. You've got to think about different processes to illuminate that to make sure you're making the right calls. A lot of times we don't spend, we get some visualizations on flow, but we don't spend the time to get to that next level to understand some of the more intricate details to expose things like neglected work. So neglected work existing is perishable and wasteful. It's going to consume space. People are going to talk about it. I can't begin to measure how many countless hours I've lost talking about tickets that never get done. It's going to delay other tasks, and it's a good friend of thief too much whip. You see it normally not on your whip of in-progress work, but it usually rears its face in a backlog. So those are the thieves. Now I want to talk about exposing the thieves. So in general, we acquire more information through vision than all other four senses. So we've got to figure out ways to visualize things because our experiences and what we feel are just not going to translate into effective justifications to do anything differently. Unlike physical labor, when you can actually see, at the construction site how much work is sitting there, or in a manufacturing plant, how much idle work is sitting there, knowledge work is tucked away in code and in people's brains. So what we also tend to do is we ignore the mundane, so we create this illusion of simplicity and a facade of alignment. So what I mean there is that we just assume that everybody else knows what we're experiencing. Oh yeah, the regression has all these problems, but everybody knows that. No, the difference is people might know it's a problem, but they don't know how big of a problem it is. So by creating these visualizations, we're going to promote accountability. And using tools like Kanban is going to be an effective way to help support that accountability. So of all of the thieves, it's very effective to tackle too much whip. So tracking whip is going to help avoid further distractions. And this isn't like, I'll just keep hitting it home, this isn't just your dev board. There's whip in various forms throughout what you do. Think about breaking down the work into categories, which will also help you identify flow. There's a difference between unplanned work and planned work. There's different sources of work. There's different types of work. You should consider tools like a separate queue or a swim lane to support you with this. There is always going to be somewhere that has a push model into it, but the more we can pull that out into a separate queue that we can then pull from, the more effectively we can then say no. Or we don't even have to say no. So what I'd like to do now is, my main goal is to go over those types of thieves and get you guys thinking about all the different time thieves that exist to try to help promote visualizations in different aspects and different angles that you may not have been thinking about. I'll provide some examples of some different angles now, but I'd say the important stuff is what we already just went over. So here's an example of a push model into a system that has 9 tickets a day going into this inter-squad planning process where we're meeting at a weekly cadence of, at one point, 90 minutes a week. So that's every lead, so call it 6 or 7 people, 90 minutes. We're talking about a cost of about 10 hours a week to figure out what to do with all these tickets coming in. That's still the case, and we're still trying to manage it, but we're considering moving towards something where we stop the push from coming all the way into the backlog and start having them manage their own queues that we can pull from. If we can have this agreed upon flow from there, we don't have to keep telling people no. We just say that you tell us what's the most important and we'll agree to pulling at some rate. If we did it in this approach, I'm firmly confident we could get the 90-minute meeting down to about 30 minutes or save about 6 to 7 hours a week. So yeah, like I said, if the people that are the source of the requests manage their own priorities, you don't have to say no. This is a visualization of work on order stream that has gone through the backlog state and then been completed. So you can see a couple different things here. One is the fact that one thing that you can't see here, but I'll point out, is that there's 29 issues. That's out of 352 that we completed. So that means that out of 352 things, we've pulled 29 from this inter-squad backlog. It means it's a starved source of work. On top of that, you can see that those dots, if you look at the y-axis, we're at 400 days on some of these requests. That means if you asked us to get to something, from the state it got to the backlog to when it got out the door was 400 days. So yeah, we'll get to that in a little over a year. Exposing unplanned work. So Larry's done some great work on this one. So we have a large amount of work that is not tracked or visible that we've been trying to tackle and increase visibility, and that would be in the form of what we've been describing as request boards. If we don't have a visualization of the work, it's going to be hard to justify doing anything different. So we've had project boards as teams, but now let's start creating this idea of a request board, and we can start saying planned and unplanned. And then there's another slice to what may be considered unplanned, and that's non-epic works. So the more we can slice these works into different categories, the more likely we are to effectively plan for unplanned work. Another example of tackling thief conflicting priorities is we recently instituted a business priority board. This is a simple set of tickets which describe at a high level, a milestone level, multi-epic, what are we accomplishing currently on order stream and what are their priorities with each other so that we can make sure that we're effectively managing how much we're focusing on each thing and if we need to adjust support call schedules and things like that. We recently added a notification system to the leadership room so that anytime anyone does anything with those priorities, we get notified, and we just are using a simple comment model so that we can say, all right, this is our source of truth, this is how we're going to know if the priorities change, and we can collaborate between each other to make sure that everyone is using this one source of truth and reduce things like push requests via email and HIP chat and other tools. Here's a picture of my whip. So I take the time every week to fill out everything I do on my calendar. At the end of the day, I go back and I fill it in. I've done this, and I also don't hold a to-do list. Anytime I need to get something done, I immediately go to my calendar and I add a free slot, or mark it as free so that people don't see me as busy, and put that item in there. That then forces me to do a quick estimation of how large the item is, and then gives me a realistic approach to setting an appropriate expectation. This was motivated by 2 articles I linked in here, between why calendars are more effective than to-do lists and approaches to limiting your PIP, or promises in progress. So that's it. That's all I've got. In general, we started with saying that time is like money, but I would say that time is much more important than money. It's a perishable good that is not something. There's no amount of money that I will usually trade for. Well, I guess there is some level, but in general, I don't trade time for money very often. And Comic Sans isn't that bad. That's all I've got.
How long have you been using the calendar as your, or in place of a to-do?
About a year.
Happy with it?
Yeah, extremely happy. I can say, when somebody says a request, I can do when I have a request, let's say from like a director or whatever, I can say, okay, I can do one of 2 things. I can get back to you by next Thursday, or we can talk about which one of my priorities isn't as important as I currently have it placed on my to-do list.
Mm.
And then I can drag that and then drag in that to the new slot.
Mm.
So it's been a great tool to promote alignment.
Do you use it for personal stuff too? Like a separate calendar?
No.
No?
Yeah, my personal promises in progress are, like, as noted by this, how long it took me to convince myself to write this presentation, could use some work. Darren?
Planning for unplanned work.
Yeah.
How much time do you plan for unplanned work?
How much time do I plan for unplanned work? Oh, so that's an interesting one. Do you mean me personally on my personal time?
Should anybody, I guess.
Yeah, there's different layers. Just like we were talking about WIP and which aspect you were talking about. It depends if you mean. So I'll start with me. So what happened was when I first went to this calendar approach, I didn't plan for any unplanned work, and it caused a ridiculous amount of stress because I filled out 9 to 5 every day what I thought I was going to get done, and lo and behold, things come up, and I had this silly idea that I was going to just be able to take care of my entire calendar. So now I usually have 2 to 3 half-hour slots throughout the week and each day to support unplanned work. So that was my evolution of unplanned work on my personal board. Unplanned work at a team level needs to be, you need to try to use trends to create predictability. So this is where those ideas of the non-epic work and the request board come in and become useful tools to say, we don't have that level of capacity. We're 4 people on this team will be just unplanned, run the business, whatever you want to call it. It can't go towards these roadmap items.
Yeah, I think I was thinking more along lines of like estimates and stuff like that. When you're trying to estimate projects and stuff, you know that unplanned work is part of that, but trying to quantify that and trying to relay that is kind of hard to do.
So I think for any of these things, you have to create a framework and a feedback loop. So I would say that we have room for improvement on the framework for estimation and its feedback loop. So we could be more effective at after an estimation is actually executed, which is a large cycle time, right? Because we're talking months. What did we say we were going to do? What did we do? And what's that feedback into our process? So I think there's room for improvement there.
Isn't you waiting until the last second to do this just reducing your WIP on the presentation? So waiting until the last second so it's not in progress for that long, right?
Yeah, but that's it. It became.
Still on your mind.
Just in time? No. What would it be? Thief. Well, I guess it was just stress levels, right? I was working on that, like tidying.
It's just like a personal issue then.
Yeah, tidying. Well, it's on there, right? The unplanned work is going to increase stress. So, or this was planned, it's just poorly prioritized. Either way, I was working on this at like 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock last night, doing final touches on it. So I would have rather have been, I don't know, watching something on Netflix. So.
Has anybody given a presentation and not worked on it the night before?
I have.
Okay.
It's possible, I swear.
Theoretically, you've been thinking about this presentation since you agreed to do it. So it's been work in progress since however many months ago that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For mental, right?
Right.
Yeah, it has been taking up a sliver of my mental capacity for 1 to 2 months.
Two things I remembered I wanted to mention. One was Jeff Bezos' two pizza teams. If you make up a team of only people that don't eat pizza, does that mean you can have an unboundedly sized team?
Or they're not allowed on the team. I don't know which of the two.
More seriously though, at a previous job, I remember we had a system that when work came in, it would just throw it into an unbounded thread pool and just do the work immediately. The system that this process ran on had 4 processors, but you could easily get 1,000 threads spinning up at the same time when a huge batch of work would come in. And the original designers were just under the assumption, well, the additional threads don't use up too much extra memory. We have plenty of memory, so it doesn't matter. We came along later and discovered how this worked, and we're like, no, this does not work. Context switching in CPUs is still slow. And we switched it to a bounded thread pool of the number of CPUs that the machine had, and the process got like 4 times faster.
That's it.
End to end.
Yep, and we're not that.
Yeah, and humans are way
And we're way
worse
worse.
at doing that.
I wish it was only 4x.
I saw something recently about how we're generally misusing the term multitasking, because if you're truly doing multitasking, there is no context switching.
Right.
You're literally doing multiple things simultaneously.
Yeah.
So.
And you can argue the nuances of that at all times. Like
Yeah.
maybe like breathing and digesting. I think I got that one going on pretty well. But
Yeah.
that's about it.
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else?
Let's get some time back.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.